Back. I'm going to now finish the lecture on feminism. Um, where I left off is I was going to look at feminism within the context of political theory more generally. Um, I think in general it would be fair to say that feminists have not given a great deal of attention to political theory, at least in within the spectrum of the historical spectrum of political theory. Not much attention to the classics, except perhaps Marx and Marxist writers and postmodern writers. Um, so there's not a lot of philosophical context or points of comparison often given much attention to. This is a problem for a lot of ideological groups, but you do have some notable exceptions. I mean, I mentioned Mary Wollstonecraft. Wrote this book, "The Rights of Women." Of woman, actually, it's the rights of woman, responding to the rights of man. Was the phrase back in those days in the 18th century, and sort of presenting women's rights in a context of a theory uh, of natural rights, a liberal theory of natural rights, such as by people like John Locke. And then more recently, still teaching, I think, a college professor named Martha Nussbaum, who does work on Greek philosophy, Greek tragedies, and that kind of thing. And in your reader, you saw this woman, Susan Moeller Oken, who is trying to fill this gap a little bit in terms of political theory and develop a theory of justice in relation to feminism. Um, but largely, I think you could say that, that greater emphasis has been given uh, by feminists to activism than to philosophy. Um, and I'll explain what I mean. I'm not denying that they're looking at ostensibly philosophical works, but I have something definite in mind. Um, Feminists have tended, like Marx, uh, to uh, toward activism and advocacy than uh, to giving critical investigation and articulation of fundamental principles. I mean, of course, the postmoderns are against, if that's what philosophy means, or a development of fundamental fixed principles, then postmodernism is opposed to philosophy per se, right? Um, so and so the primary grounding, intellectual grounding for feminists after the first wave has been in late modern theory, um, existentialism, neo-Marxism, psychoanalytical theory, postmodernism, and so forth. All of which tend to reject that philosophy. Well, they all do reject philosophy in this classical sense, right? Um, but unfortunately, this means that they lack the means by which to judge the truth of their premises. I mean, if you say there is no such truth, then why should your claims be considered any more compelling than anyone else's claims? Why should the claims of feminism be more compelling than the claims of hyper-masculine fascism, right? On what basis do you say that yours is better? You always come back to some idea about what's better and worse, which is a question about what's good, which is a question that if you're going to move towards uh, better and therefore good, it needs to be defined somehow. And if that's entirely fluid, then, well, you see the problem. Um, So let's put this in broader philosophical context, starting with classical political theory. Well, one of the uh, I mean there are a number of classical Greek um, works that give interesting treatment to male female relations. You do have the woman poet Sappho, uh, who is famous, gets a lot of attention these days. You have a lot of the male authors also giving interesting treatments of questions of uh, male female relations and uh, contributions that women can make to society and so forth. Uh, there's one of the classics is Sophocles' Antigone, where Antigone is the whole play centers around this woman Antigone and the king Cleon, and basically Cleon. There's a civil war going on, and Cleon, the royal forces won, and Cleon the king has issued an order that to discourage this kind of rebellion, that none of the dead rebels will be allowed to be buried, and this is even worse than it would be today because in religion at the time there were huge consequences in the afterlife if you never got a proper burial, um, and and uh, and one of these rebels was Antigone's one of Antigone's brothers, um, and Antigone said that uh, well, she had to bury her brother, so she violated the decree and was hauled up in front of the king. And the king, said, what do you have to say for yourself? And she defended herself in an interesting way. Not only talking about uh, you know her the horrendous consequences to her brother, but that she was obeying the will of the gods, a, a law from time immemorial that trumped any law of man. So it's a kind of appeal to natural law, and Cleon responds that uh, this is not entirely correct, or I can't remember exactly his response, but it ended up being that the play is actually an interesting analysis of tension between uh, certain social goods, such as discouraging rebellion, and so it gave some sympathy to Cleon's situation and suggested that Antigone did not um, adequately uh, respect this social need. But on the other hand, she is the hero of the thing, and she gets more credit than Cleon. She is more right than he is, or less wrong than he is, both. Um, but the account I want to focus on, may seem a little strange to you, is Plato's treatment in Book 5 of the Republic. Book 5 is wrongly interpreted or misunderstood by moderns typically as being a program for a totalitarian system. I think a more careful reading suggests that Plato is making a profound investigation of the problem of passions. It's a quasi satirical um, um, presentation of a sort of thought experiment in a political order that reveals uh, problems about human passions and problems about human nature. Um, and so, anyway, in Book 5, Socrates presents three waves of reform that will need to take place, supposedly, to achieve the kind of leadership in society that is single-mindedly dedicated to the common good. Um, and he mentions three waves. The first wave will be involve equality of the sexes. The second wave will involve a communism of women and children. And the third wave will involve what Socrates says, and this is an indication of the satirical edge here, the most ridiculous, most unbelievable proposition that a philosopher should rule. Um, and this all has to do specifically with the guardian class, shaping the guardian class. On the point about natural equality, he raises the question of whether women shouldn't be included in the pool of potential guardians, political rulers. Um, and he concludes, Socrates concludes after this conversation with his friends here, that women are equally capable of men as of being rulers in the decisive respect of equal intellectual capacity, that they share in reason as men do, and because of their capacity for reason, uh, they have what it takes to rule. The critical necessity of a ruler is to have wisdom, which was a knowledge of the good, or what's good for society, and that women were as capable of this as men. And after all, people with a highly developed capacity in this are relatively rare. So we need to broaden the pool of potential talent. Um, and, and therefore we need to bring in women as half the population, right? So that's the first wave. And so far, so good, it seems. At least as the way it's presented, there doesn't seem to be any philosophical problem. There doesn't seem to be any good objection to be made. But then, in the part that comes next, there perhaps is. Socrates says, and this gets to the question of what kind of equality are you talking about? Socrates says that, well, if these women are going to be guardians, they have to go through the same regimen that all of the male guardians go through, so that they have everything it takes to rule. And part of this regimen was physical training, and the way the Greeks like to do their athletic exercises was in the nude. So Adeimantus, who's the usual objector, is sort of, wait a minute, I can see problems here, and Socrates makes some kind of argument that's perhaps not entirely compelling. That they need to indeed practice in the nude together. You might think of, have you ever seen the movie, read the book? I don't know anything about the book. It's much better than the movie. This is always the case. But in the movie Stormtroopers, where there's these women with the men in combat, and when they shower and stuff, they're all together, and things like this. But Socrates is pushing the question of how far do we want to take equality here? Does equality of ability in this essential point, the most essential point of rationality, should that result in complete equal treatment in every respect? And of course, most people, common sense reaction would be, this is a recipe for some bad things happening. If you have men and women mixing in the nude, I mean, aren't some men going to find it difficult to resist the 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 drive of the sexual impulse, right? Um, and so he's doing is he's raising the he's trying to probe philosophically, the nature of equality between men and women and what it implies practically, right? Um, then he brings up this second wave. I'm not going to talk about the third wave, the ridiculous wave of the rule of the philosopher, but the second wave had to do with communism of women and children. The idea was essentially that you were going to abolish marriage, and that um, the whole guardian class, there wouldn't be any private possessions of any kind, not physical property, and not families either. You don't want any private attachments because the idea was that you're going to make this guardian class single-mindedly focused on the common good, not attached to any of your private interests, which after all is the basis of all kinds of problems when the interest of the ruler becomes in conflict with the interest of society. And so the idea in this thought experiment is um, let's not let's have every all of the adults, the men and women, none of them be exclusive partners, but they'll all alike be husband and wife, if you will. And they will be all alike be parents of all the children. Um, and uh, and and again, I mean the the problem that Plato is exploring here is, with the question of natural limits and whether or not um, an institution like marriage is kind of a natural way of dealing with the problems that might arise in this scenario. I mean, you see Aristotle in Book 2 of Aristotle's Politics address Book 5 of Plato's Republic and points out all kinds of problems with this schema that's being presented. I'm sure Aristotle was aware that Plato was playing around a little bit, but he perhaps was worried that some people wouldn't pick up the hint, and he was certainly right about that. Um, but um, you know, he's thinking through the problem of nature, and he's thinking through uh, the potential consequences of violating the limits of nature, right? So you think about the communism of women and children. That would violate the traditional prohibition against uh, incest because you're not supposed to know whose children are whose and that kind of thing. So you may actually end up, if you're getting older and one of these women have grown up, one of these children have grown up, well, you might end up sleeping with your daughter, and this kind of thing. And how would you prevent that kind of thing? Traditionally, there's a powerful uh, uh, prohibition against incest, and this is usually thought of as being a natural prohibition. And so, would this scheme, in fact, not involve a certain violation of the sacred? Um, and that would be not only unnatural, but uh, extremely perverse, right? And Plato doesn't give answers to all these questions, but he's suggesting that if you're thinking about fundamentally transforming the order of society, then you need to think about the potential consequences of this, and you need to think about uh, uh, where the lines should be drawn, and that's going to lead you eventually to this question, perhaps, of nature. More on that in a moment. Um, if you look back to Book 1 of Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle is typically you might say, friendlier to tradition than Plato. Plato Socrates is much more willing to attack traditions um, than Aristotle. And, um, and Aristotle presents Book One sort of what is kind of be thought of as the traditional idea of uh, the place of women in society, right? So the conception of the household, there's a husband and wife, and they parent the children, but the husband has a you know a higher status. But it's interesting that Aristotle describes as there's different types of rule in the household, um, and in the Greek household included slaves, at least for people who could afford them. Um, and and so he said, well, the rule of the master of the slave is a kind of despotic rule because you don't negotiate with a slave. You just tell him what to do. And the rule of parent over child is something more like monarchical rule, which is the traditional idea of monarchy was that the king rules the society like a father rules his children, and so it's not simply giving orders, but it's it's in a context of affection and um, trying to develop in the child a sense of uh, why they're doing what they're doing. Although Aristotle says that this should be done towards the slave to some degree too. But in terms of the relationship of the husband and the wife, um, Aristotle described this type of rule as political rule. And elsewhere, he defines political rule as rule among equals. Um, in terms of social order, it's a sharing in ruling and being ruled. And um, it looks like he fundamentally accepts Plato's suggestion that men and women are equal with respect to reason. Um, but he says, what Aristotle brings in is that the man has a more authoritarian, excuse me, that's a feminist slip, a more authoritative element than the woman. I think he has an idea of sort of a natural greater assertiveness, and therefore, in the final analysis, he has to be sort of the decider on big issues with the household. But it's interesting because this related to the idea of the order of the household. Uh, the idea was that the woman ruled the households for all intents and purposes, and the man ruled the affairs beyond the household, right? So you could say a woman's place is in the home, if you wanted to put it in negative terms, right? But you could say positively that the woman was the ruler in the context of the household, right? So they're sharing and ruling and being ruled in this respect, right? Um, so and then Aristotle had an idea about what the relationship between the household and society was. He understood the household as the natural unit of society, the natural building block, natural foundation of society, and the primary incubator of the moral and the civic virtues too, that are essential for social life. And women played a crucial role here, although she doesn't define exactly their role. So that's kind of more of the traditional view. It's more nuanced than maybe a stereotypical presentation, but certainly basically corresponds with the idea of the traditional household. Um, Locke brings in a liberal flavor to it, stressing the voluntary nature of this arrangement. In the second treatise, he implies that arranged marriages are unacceptable, that marriage is a kind of voluntary contract, not just a kind of covenant before God, right? This religious conception, but a, a contractual arrangement for the purpose of raising children. That's a specific purpose of marriage uh, for Locke, and so the the woman was, an equal party to the contract. And he also, in the second treatise, attacks the essentially attacks the idea of the patriarchal family. Um, that he he's responding to Robert Filmer's book Patriarcha. Um, Long story, but the general idea of Filmer's book was that there's monarchy is the right form of government because descending down all the way from Adam, this was the this was the model of rule that God favored. Um, and Locke, in the first treatise of the two treatises, the one nobody reads, but it's interesting to read, um, totally obliterates Filmer's argument. But in the second treatise, he extends the point in relation to male-female relationships by saying we shouldn't talk about paternal rule as Filmer and many others had through history. We should talk about parental rule. And mother and father had an equal parental role, at least in terms of the general idea of parenting, right? And physically caring for their child, educating their child, and so forth. Then you come to Mary Wollstonecraft. I'm not obviously giving a comprehensive history here, just to focus on some highlights that maybe will be revealing. But Mary Wollstonecraft, we've talked about, her Rights of Woman, again, is founded upon the idea of natural rights. And her idea of natural rights is simply the idea of natural rights conceived in liberal theory. And so, from her perspective, there's nothing wrong with the theory of natural rights per se. It just needed to be applied to women in practice, right? And then Wollstonecraft, even though she's sort of always presented as a feminist, she holds to this, you could say, somewhat more of a conservative view. I mean, it's certainly a more conservative view, but the idea that there's a special role for women in promoting virtue, moral character, and that their special role is related to natural differences, feminine virtues, more, nurturing ability, and so forth and so on, right? And so her vision, and this is somewhat true also of Jane Addams, as I mentioned, who's a big reformer, very, very, very actively engaged in reform. They understand the woman as having a special role in the household and in society, and they follow that conclusion with, others have said this before, women play this role, but people like Rousseau and people like Aristotle, in a very different way, have all taken that social role to be a matter of what they do in the household. And Wollstonecraft and later Jane Addams are saying that to play that role effectively, they have to be engaged beyond the household. They have to be engaged in political decision making, and even Wollstonecraft says they have to be members of government. I mean, she was arguing for that they should be represented in Parliament and so forth. Well, let me take all this a little closer to home and look at the American founders and their legacy. And I'll start with the most famous couple, the American founding, uh, John and Abigail Adams. So John Adams is called the Colossus of the Congress. I can't remember exactly the phrase, but Colossus was in there because he was probably the single most important voice in convincing the Continental Congress to make the decision for independence against Britain. And he was, along with Jefferson, probably the most important philosopher of the American Revolution and the American principles, right? And if you want to see visually portrayed the relationship between Abigail and John Adams, the HBO series John Adams does a beautiful job of it. It's very historically accurate, and because it's a very close rendering of an excellent historian's account. It's of David McCullough. Um, but I want to read you their exchange um, because it's very interesting. The context is it's 1776. The convention is ongoing at the Continental Congress, and and Abigail writes this: March 31, 1776. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies, famous phrase, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Hey, yo, I'm recording. Sorry, family stuff. So remember the ladies. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husband. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give it up. The harsh title of master for the more tender and enduring one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the servants of your sex. Regard us then as being placed by Providence under your protection. And in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. April 14, 1776, John Adams to Abigail Adams. As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and blacks grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too harsh a compliment, but you are so saucy, I will not blot it out. In other words, cross it out in his letter. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat. I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. May 7, 1776. Abigail to John. I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But if you must remember that arbitrary power is like, but you must remember that arbitrary power is like most of the things, which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power, not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence, throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. End of the exchange. Now, this is a fascinating exchange. I mean, it covers all the basic areas that are issues in feminism. Uh, so, men are tyrants. Check. Female suffrage. She calls for representation, right? Check. Campus radicalism. Adams talks about people claiming that the schools and colleges have grown turbulent in relation to the revolution, which is true. Check. Indians and slaves, race, in terms of neo-Marxism, check. The scope of tyranny of this group, another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest. I mean, half of the population, right? Women, check. Masculine systems. Adams used the phrase. Sounds like patriarchy. Check. And then the charge of hypocrisy. That, Abigail. And this was the case with slaves too. A lot of people made the point. The contradiction between all this emancipation, this talk of emancipation and the rights of man and so forth, but insisting on retaining absolute power over wives. So hypocrisy, check. And yet, there are some nuances within this treatment that suggest that it's in some tension with feminism as it has come to be developed. I mean, first of all, there's clearly an element of playfulness in this exchange and trust. You are so saucy, says John, right? And Abigail ends up basically reiterating John's point about women really being in charge, right? And their trust was extraordinary. I mean, this couple this was the greatest romance of the founding period. I mean, they weren't glamorous folks, but in terms of a relationship, I mean, Adams was famous or infamous, depending on who you asked, for taking Abigail as his sort of most important advisor, political advisor, and he was sometimes saved from really bad moves by her advice. The respect he had for her was extraordinary, and her influence on him was extraordinary. She was actually she was the cooler head in the more steady personality emotionally in the group. Adams was notorious for getting too carried away with his emotions and then saying things that caused offense and sort of undermined what he was trying to do because he made it personal and that kind of thing. She was always reining him in. So there's a trust and respect here, right? And notice that Abigail acknowledges that, as she puts it, men of sense in all ages have respected women. Right? she sort of contrasts civilized versus uncivilized people um, on this point, which points to, I mean, as these guys exemplify, um, presenting the whole history of humanity as one long oppression of men over women is, it's, it lacks nuance. I mean, there's there's certainly certainly not quite that monolithic, uh, but but she also appeals to a supreme being, right? Divine providence, who gives and protects the rights of women. Ultimately, right? Uh, their justice will be upheld. If not in this life, then certainly in the next. And so she has a higher source to appeal to, which is an absolute ground of the rights of women that she is concerned with. I mean, this is not all a joke. I mean, she's seriously concerned with this, and Adams probably overestimates in his response letter the degree to which she's serious, um, and so on. But and also there's this recognition of this natural power of women. Uh, you know, uh, Assuming a scenario where men are not just brutes, forcing sex on their wives, uh, the women have a great deal of power in this particular area. They can sort of dictate a lot of terms by withholding sex. So the power of the sex strike, you might say. Um, um, my point is in all this is that this exchange is bringing out a lot of subtleties and nuances in the relationship between men and women, even while it points to um, foundations for feminism um, in a broadly conceived. Um, the Declaration of Independence is crucial here. I mean, these guys are talking about the Declaration and then the anticipated Constitution after this. These guys, I mean, Abigail and John Adams. But the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And a lot of people have pointed out, well, what about women? Well, I mean, certainly in this context, men meant human beings. People have said the same thing about blacks and slaves at the time of the founding, and I can send you um, a write-up on that, looking at historical evidence and so forth. But it's essentially provable that Jefferson meant to include in all men slaves, because in his first draft of the Declaration, he included a condemnation of the slave trade as a kind of crime against humanity, because it was a market where men are bought and sold, and he puts men in all caps, uh, and so on. I mean, leave aside the problem that he was a slave owner himself, um, that he did want gradual emancipation of slavery, and he proposed abolishing slavery in the state of Virginia as governor, and so on. It's complicated with Jefferson, but my point is that it was understood that this meant human beings, and it would have been unthinkable for any of the founders. Uh, but you imagine John Adams to make it concrete that their wives are not human beings. This is absurd. Um, so the question and the question of the Declaration is, well, the key question there is, in what sense are all human beings equal, right? So bear that thought in mind. I mentioned before the Declaration of Sentiments, written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and signed by all those women at the Declaration at the Seneca Falls, New York convention of women there for the purpose of supporting women's rights, and how how the Declaration was an inspiration and template for it. Um, and this was the case not only in the civil rights movement for the rights of African Americans, but also women too, at least for a time, until today when uh, basically you have a lot of people on the left arguing that the Declaration of Independence is a racist document and the Constitution is a racist document and so forth. Um, a lot of people took the Declaration as indeed applying universally, um, or at least laying the groundwork for a universal um, application. So I think it would be helpful in this regard to mention what Lincoln said on the Declaration of Independence in response to people who were in fact making this claim that all men meant all white Englishmen. That is the way that it was put in the Dred Scott decision by Chief Justice Taney. Um, and Lincoln wrote a speech in response to that, wrote a lot of other things, brings it up in the Stephen Douglas debates as well, about this decision. And he critiques the decision on legal grounds and so forth. But one of the things he spends a lot of time on is what he sees as a misuse of the Declaration of Independence, because, and he goes about trying to prove that the Declaration of Independence was, in the Declaration, all men did not mean white Englishmen. It was never understood to be restrictive in that way, that it applied to all human beings, etc. And he makes a similar argument about the Constitution, too, in his Cooper Union address. Very, very important for his election, the Cooper Union address. But I'm presenting his here to apply it to women to indicate a key point here. So I'll quote from this speech he made on the Dred Scott decision. Now it's getting a little dry here, so sorry for all the water drinking. Here's a quote. And he's responding again to Dred Scott's claim about the Declaration, about the all men clause. I think the authors of the Declaration intended to include all men, meaning all human beings, but they did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all were equal in color, size, intellect, moral developments, or social capacity. So here he's bringing up the question of what kind of equality are we talking about? They defined with tolerable distinctness in what respects they did consider all men created equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Inalienable meaning we cannot alienate it from ourselves. They cannot be taken away because they're from God. They're not from man. Continuing Lincoln's comments. This they said, and this meant. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality. I mean, slavery continued. Right? Nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In other words, they were not about to immediately abolish slavery. In fact, this is why, they had no power to confer such a boon. Boon meaning benefit. In his argument about the Constitution, he makes a very compelling case that the majority at the Constitutional Convention was opposed to protections for slavery, but in order to get the southern states on board, in particular the deep southern states, they were just going to have to make concessions on this point. But I mean, the point here is that they if they wanted a nation, they even if they wanted to abolish slavery, they could not. actually do it, right? They could not make it happen. Um, they meant, what did they mean? What did they mean uh, about equality? They meant simply to declare the right so that enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. I mean, we can't apply it now. We literally, physically cannot apply it now in practice. We can do certain things, but in terms of abolition. Um, but we should, at every opportunity, try to make it enforceable in practice. They meant, he goes on, they meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all peoples of all colors everywhere. Unquote. So the conclusion of this is that the basis of equality and the politically relevant kind of equality was an equality of natural rights, an equality, uh, the right to be treated justly, the right not to be a victim of injustice, right? And it says among these rights, so these are not the only ones, but it sort of singled out life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Those things are not defined here, but that's the basic idea. And then the societal goal should be the fullest possible enjoyment of those rights, right, in practice. And then the particular form, and this is the key question today, the particular form of that enjoyment would presumably be determined by democratic debate and negotiation of circumstances. Lincoln being not only an idealist but a realist. So my point then is Lincoln's model of thinking about rights provides a definite fixed standard by which to judge these matters, and provides a goal, a clear goal to move towards, and a conception of how this should happen, generally speaking, that through discussion and constantly refining understanding of what the rights, these more abstract rights, what they mean or should mean in practice, what would be the best way to fulfill them for everyone, right? So in conclusion, I would say that I was going to make a critique of feminism in general. I would say that it really needs a criterion, a standard for judging claims about what's good for women. The whole thing is, women are being treated unjustly. Things are bad for women in X, Y, or Z ways, right? But in either neglecting or discarding altogether any kind of clear idea of what is good, that is stable, permanent, at least as an ideal, then there's no clarity about to what women should aspire and what would constitute fulfillment, right? And therefore also tend to nurture a sense of constant deep dissatisfaction because you have no idea of how you're progressing. Uh, right. Um, and then the nature question, I think, has to be considered a little more carefully um, by feminist thinkers. The question about what's good for women ultimately hinges on the question of nature, human capacities, whether there are any special feminine capacities and corresponding possibilities for fulfillment. I think all the controversies within feminism really come down to those questions. Um, and as much as we're uncomfortable with addressing those kind of questions, um, it seems to me um, necessary for full philosophical coherence and uh, and necessary to be compelling to people outside of the feminist ideological orbit. If they're trying to win people over, um, uh, philosophically needs to be further development of a clear standard. I'll leave aside what that might be, um, but uh, those are my thoughts on feminism. Um, our last our last lecture on Western ideologies will be on ecologism, or usually called in the U.S. environmentalism. So I'll see you next time to talk about that.